Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Well, welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week we've got an aquatics episode up, Joe. So what do you want to talk about today?
Yeah, starting to get a lot of calls about weeds in ponds. And so along with that, a lot of times comes the question of, hey, can we stock grass carp?
Sure.
So I wanted to talk about grass carp, some of the benefits, some of the drawbacks, and why you may or may not want to stock them in your pond.
Yeah. So I guess, a little bit of history. Tell us about grass carp, where they came from. Are they native to North America?
Yep, not native to North America. They're from Asia, and so we brought them over in the 60s, mainly as a research vessel. Over in Asia, they're a delicacy. They really like to eat grass carp, and they also help with some vegetative controls. We brought them over here to see kind of what we could do. There was a big flood in Arkansas that occurred in the 60s, right after we brought them over, and near Stuttgart, Arkansas, they got released out into the wild, and they were able to reproduce some, and so that's happened in a couple other locations since then. But so they were spread around kind of in that way. So because of that flood, that connectivity issue. And so they've just been kind of spread around, and now we actually introduce them a lot of times to ponds or certain bodies of water to kind of allow them to establish there. And so they've been in Kansas since about the 1970s. Okay. Mid to late 70s is kind of when they started to be observed in some of the waterways of Kansas. We've been stocking them for the last 30 or 40 years probably in a lot of private ponds. So kind of a little bit of history there and kind of what we're doing with them.
Yeah, sure. The ones that are stocked here in Kansas, are those the same kind that can reproduce, or are there any restrictions about that?
Yeah, so there's a characteristic called triploidy or ploidy, and basically we add some extra genetic material into the fish and make it so that they can't reproduce. And so the fish that you buy in Kansas to be able to purchase them legally are triploid carp. Now, we say they can't reproduce. One of the important things is that there's a failure rate of somewhere around 0.1%. So it's not 100% effective. And when we're talking about fish that can make millions of eggs, it doesn't take very many to escape to be able to reproduce. And so making sure they're triploid, making sure you're buying them from someone where they've been certified is really important.
Sure. So I guess I jumped ahead a little bit there. Is why do we want them to be triploid? Are
Sure.
they? I know we have Asian carp that are invasive. Or do they sort of fall into that?
Yeah, so the Asian carp that we're talking about, these carp are from Asia. It's important that we mention again that we're talking about grass carp. So Tenepharingodon adela, they have kind of a fun name to say, is the exact grass carp that we're talking about. Introducing them to native waterways, they can compete a lot with some of the native species that we have. And so they can do things like consume plant materials that we don't want them to.
Sure.
So there are some really beneficial plants that we may want that they might think is really tasty, right? And so if we let them out, they might eat all of that. They might eat a lot of vegetation that other critters might want to eat. So certain insects, certain crayfish only are going to eat certain types of plants. And so if we allow this fish to outcompete them, that might become issues. And so they also can really affect the nutrient cycle. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but allowing them to establish in waterways where we don't want them can cause unintended consequences.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I've part of the reason I asked that question is because when I've seen pictures of the different invasive Asian carp species that we have, the silver carp looks a lot different. The big head carp looks a lot different, but I've seen pictures of black carp, and I always kind of wondered, is a black carp and a grass carp the same thing? It's just one's triploid and one's not, and I don't know.
Yeah, it goes back to the genetics. It's not necessarily one's triploid and one's not. It's just kind of differences in what they're expressing. So
Sure.
Some of the phenotypic variation there.
Cool. Cool. So, if we've put some of these, if we started putting grass carp out in the 1970s, how old do those things get?
Yeah, they can live a really long time. So they've been documented to live over 100 years.
Wow.
That would be a unique specimen. Most of the time when we're not really feeding them a lot, we're not taking care of them. 50 years is probably a common age for them to get to. And that's still a really long time,
yeah, no
right?
kidding.
The really crazy thing is that they're beneficial in a pond from about age 3 to about age 7. That's what the research shows. That's when they eat a lot of vegetation. Really good for helping to control that vegetation. But when they start to get bigger, they can often cause more problems than they're helping. So we think about a 50-year-old fish that might weigh 50 pounds.
Wow.
That's quite a bit of biomass and quite an old plant there that can cause some issues. But because they're only effective up till age 7, we need to kind of have a plan for what we're going to do to them or what we're going to do with them once they get bigger.
Sure. So what would you do when they get bigger?
Yeah, they're really good swimmers. They are up there with tuna as some of the best swimmers, most powerful swimmers that there are. So really, really good swimmers, and they like to eat plant material. So they're not super easy to catch. They are fun as heck to catch if you hook into them. And there are some times that you can, use a hook and line and maybe a piece of corn to catch them.
Sure.
Some people do that. It's not really that easy to do. You can try to seine them, but because they're such good, fast swimmers, that can be really hard to do. The most effective technique is to bow fish for them. And so go out and harvest that fish and pull them out of the pond. And that can be really enjoyable too. Give you quite a bit of a fight there while you're out. You're removing them from that pond so you can open it up and maybe put more grass carp in.
Yeah, that's definitely a pastime I enjoy. When I had more open nights and had lights on my boat and went out and did that, that was something I did quite a bit of, like catching common carp that way.
Yep.
And also every once in a while when I'd see a big grass carp in a place where it made sense to take one out, I would. And they're fun.
Yeah, and it's
fish.
important to remember that, they're not native fish. They're not supposed to be there a lot of the time. And so when we're talking about removal, it's a good technique to get rid of some of those animals that shouldn't be there that are, potentially detrimental to some of the native species that could be there.
Absolutely. So you said that you're starting to have folks reach out to you because they're concerned about plant problems and all that sort of thing. So how do you know when you have too many plants?
Yeah. I kind of tell people it's if you think you have too many plants, then you do. And so the rule of thumb is somewhere around 20 to 25% of your pond covered in plants. I'm a fisherman and a duck hunter. I like to be outside. And so I like to be around ponds that some people would think look ugly. They might have some cattails. They're going to have some submerged vegetation. To me, that means that pond is good from an ecological standpoint. So I think that looks pretty. Other people I go meet with, golf courses are a good example, where they want to have pristine waters and they don't want any vegetation out there, and they think that looks pretty. So it comes down to kind of what you want for your pond, what your desired outcome is. We talk a lot about having a goal for your pond. Mm-hmm. So kind of knowing what you want to do, but as a rule of thumb, when you start to get more than that 25% coverage of your pond and vegetation, that can start to be indicative of, hey, we better do something about this before it gets to a point we can't bring it back.
Sure, that makes sense. Is there a specific kind of vegetation that it makes sense to stock them for? And I mean, do they eat everything?
Yeah, vegetation falls into a few different main groups. And so emergent vegetation is one of them, and cattails are a good example. They have really wet roots or wet feet is what we would say. And then the plant itself grows out of the water. So they're going to be found around the edge of the pond or in really shallow water generally. You can have floating vegetation like duckweed and watermeal, and that, just like its name, floats on top. Submerged vegetation is going to grow almost exclusively underwater. So around here, coontail is a really common example of that. And then there's algae. And so algae is actually single cells. Sometimes they grow together and form colonies. So things like Cara come to mind. Filamentous algae is really common. People would call that pond moss a lot of times, so very common out there. Grass carp are really picky in what they're going to eat. So grass carp really, really like new shoots, so they like the young growth. If you have an established population of cattails out in your pond, putting a grass carp in there isn't going to do you any bit of good because they're not going to eat that kind of stuff, right? They'll eat a little bit of floating vegetation. They might eat some watermeal or duckweed, but again, they're not going to eat a ton of that. What they are good at eating, they like chara, which is a type of algae. And they like some submerged vegetation, so they tend to be picky on what they eat. The other thing is, if they get a mouthful of something and they don't like it, they might go take 3 or 4 bites of a coontail, a submerged plant, and decide that one of those pieces is too tough. And so what they decide to do is spit it all out, right? And each of those little pieces that they have bit off can go settle back down into the substrate and propagate. And so I hear from people quite often that they stocked grass carp and they actually see their vegetation problem get worse, which is counterintuitive, but a lot of times that's the reason it happens.
Interesting. So are there any other challenges associated with the grass carp? I mean, they're eating some plants and sometimes they're spreading things. Do they cause any other problems?
Yeah, especially when they get bigger, they cause quite a few problems. And so when they start to get really big, they just swimming around. So think about swimming where there's some muck or some mud at the bottom of a pond. They can stir all that up and make the water more turbid, make it darker. That can have cascading effects with how much sunlight we're getting to the bottom of our pond, how much plants growing. Some plants are good. They're giving off oxygen during the day, and that's important for the nitrogen cycle. So you can have all of that disrupted. One of the big things grass carp do is that they transfer nutrients. And so the plants that are growing are taking nutrients from the substrate and they're kind of holding it, in a form that the plant is utilizing. And they're going to grow and hold on to those nutrients so that it's only available to them. Well, if the grass carp eat those plants and they run it through their digestive system, when they excrete that plant material, those nutrients then become available to a lot of other things.
Sure.
And so you might have a growth of algae or harmful algal blooms, cyanobacteria that can all come from that increase in nutrients. So, it doesn't seem like it would really disrupt things quite that much, but you start to see those cascading effects. And then to reiterate, they can, eat those plants and they can then propagate those pieces as they're moving them around. Maybe they're pulling it up by its roots and shredding it apart. And so they can actually make your problem worse if they're not being used in the right way.
Well, that's no good.
Yeah. So there's lots of concerns with grass carp. There's lots of reasons not to use them, but I tell people they're a tool, right?
Yeah.
So understanding that they're maybe part of a plan is what's important. They're not a silver bullet. You're not going to put them in your pond and everything be solved, but they can be beneficial. You just need to understand some of the downsides as well.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. If we did recommend, if you recommended to somebody that they ought to stock grass carp, how would you recommend stocking them? How many, what size, all that kind of stuff?
How many grass carp you want to stock is going to depend a little bit on how much of an issue you have. And so if you have less than maybe 15% coverage, definitely going to recommend that you get out there with some other techniques. So if you get out early in the season and you use a rake or you're using a dip net or a parachute skimmer, they make special tools. So parachute skimmer floats along the surface, really good for floating vegetation. A weed razor is just like its name. It's a really long razor that can be used to cut weeds. And so if you have just a little bit of vegetation, probably wouldn't recommend using grass carp at all. Recommend some of those other techniques. Once you start to get in that 20 to 40% range, we're going to recommend a lower amount of grass carp. So probably in the 2 to 5 per acre is where we're going to live. And so I'm going to recommend that you put a lower amount in. If you start getting over 40%, 40 to 60%, you probably want 7 to 10 grass carp, maybe even a little upwards of there. But if you get over 60%, you probably have other issues in adding grass carp. They're going to die. There's not going to be enough oxygen overnight, right? And so those are kind of the metrics that I use, but understanding, what the problem is now and how we're going to address it. But then also, what are we going to do 5 years from now when you have a bunch of big grass carp, and what could those effects be? And so one of the things to keep in mind, if you put 20 grass carp in, you might get rid of your vegetation problem quicker, but you might have a problem that's 5 times harder to fix 3 to 5 years from now. So when we're putting them in, we got to be thinking about what are some of those effects or implications, down the road for our pond.
That makes sense. That's a lot fewer than I would have expected. I'd expect you to have to put a whole pile of them out there to get anything done.
Well, 2 things there. We use the term vegetated acre, right? And so when we're thinking about it, when we measure our pond, we're looking at the area that vegetation's growing. And so if we have a really deep middle, that accounts for a large amount. We wouldn't necessarily factor that in. The other thing is, I think if you go talk to a fish farmer whose job is to sell fish, they're probably going to recommend a much higher rate, right? Just like I would if I was a fish farmer and that was my goal. And so I think a lot of that perception is because we've heard a lot higher numbers.
Yeah.
And they will fix the problem faster if you put more fish in there. But like I said, down the road, they might cause more problems. These fish can eat an incredible amount of vegetation. It's highly variable based on temperatures, but if they're at their ideal temperature, which is 70 to 80 degrees water temperature, they can eat over 100% of their body weight in vegetation a day.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's ideal conditions, right? That's not going to be expected in most ponds, but they've done studies where they've got close to 120% of their body weight eaten in vegetation each day. Normally that's closer to 25 to 50%, but still a lot of vegetation, being taken out of a system for them to think about.
Yeah, no kidding. So how big are these grass carp we're going to stock?
Well, when you stock them, the biggest thing that you want to think about is if you have any bass in your pond, you want to make sure that the grass carp are big enough that they're not going to get eaten. And so most of the time we're stocking them somewhere in the 7 or 8 inch range. Later in the season, that might get up to 12 or 14 inches. You don't want to stock them when they're really little. If you do that, bass are just going to gobble them all up, so they'll get eaten pretty quickly. The other thing that can happen quite a bit is birds are really good at finding grass carp. Grass carp like to be up in shallow areas. And so you might have predation where, herons or eagles or even hawks I've seen come down and scoop some of these fish out. And so we want to make sure that they're big enough in that 7 to 10 inch range before we stock them to make sure the bass aren't going to eat them.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. You talked a little bit about the unintended impacts that they can have in competition with other species and everything. So how do we try and make sure that they don't end up where they don't belong? Yeah,
one of the big things is that when they escape, it tends to be times that we're not thinking about it, right? And so some of these systems are really flashy, which means they can rise really quickly and fall really quickly, and so. A good example of that would be if you have a pond and you go out and you catch. I've seen people catch gar in their pond and
Sure.
They wonder how it got there. Well, even though it might seem crazy, there might be a creek that's 100 yards away that during a thunderstorm, a torrential downpour, floods enough to connect these habitats. And some of these fish are really good at swimming when there's just a tiny amount of water.
Yeah.
So, a couple inches of water connecting one body of water to another might be enough for these fish to move around. And so understanding that connectivity is the biggest thing that we can do. Things like making sure our spill pipe, our emergency tubes where the water is going to be flowing out and have fish guards on them so bigger fish can't get through is a really important thing to do. But having a plan in place, and then that's why we have that regulation to make sure that they're triploid. So in the unexpected event that they do get out, hopefully they can't reproduce into the native environment.
Sure. Talking about fish being able to move around and all that kind of stuff. I remember when I was a kid, we had a fescue pasture, and it was just about flat. I mean, there was a little bit of relief out there, but not very much. And there was an old pond and a new pond that were, a couple hundred yards apart. And I was walking around out there one day right after a big thunderstorm, and there was a couple inches of water maybe out in the pasture, and there were bluegill swimming across the pasture. There's no current at all, but finding little bluegill just out in the middle, a long way, 50 or 100 yards away from any of those ponds. So I was surprised by that.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Green sunfish are notorious for being able to go really long distances.
Yeah.
When I was in Arkansas for my master's degree, we worked on this project where alligator gar, really big, 200-pound fish, like to go up in these really small creeks. But when there's a flood, they love to go into even farmers' fields.
Yeah.
And so we were finding these fish, 200-pound fish in 3 or 4 inches of water, literally in the middle of an agriculture field. So
Wow.
It's pretty neat to see and pretty amazing what we can do. We don't see that as much as we should, because we have so many dams on our flowing water systems. And
Sure.
so it should be a natural occurrence to go out and see a bluegill in the middle of a field, but we don't see that as much, or we're probably not walking around out there as much either, but happens a lot more often than we think.
Yeah, for sure. So, Joe, if we do have some vegetation, how can we best control that vegetation?
Yeah, so controlling it is going to be a multifaceted effect. I think it's important to remember that grass carp are a tool, right? And so they're not going to be a silver bullet. Putting them in the pond isn't going to magically make all of your weeds disappear. And so they are beneficial. I mentioned before, the best thing to do is to get out there and mechanically remove it. One of the important things to remember about ponds is that they're closed systems. And so anything that we do in that pond is for the most part going to stay in that pond. If we just go out and kill plants, the plant's going to die, but those nutrients are going to stay in that pond, right? They're going to go back to the substrate. They're going to decompose, and a lot of those nutrients are going to become available to other plants that are in that pond. So if we only use herbicides, we're going to keep adding to that system, right? And same thing can be said for biological controls for grass carp. If we're just adding grass carp, we're still going to see everything occurring in that closed system. So the biggest thing is to remove as much of the plant matter as you can. And in order to do that, you have to get out early. And so getting out late spring or very early summer, as soon as you can really stand to be around your pond and start looking for vegetation and looking for concerns. The next step would be identifying what plant you have. That's really important in aquatic systems. Terrestrial herbicides have adapted, especially in the last few years. We're getting a lot more specialized instead of just broad spectrum. But in the aquatic realm, aquatic safe herbicides are really specific on what they're going to target, which plants they're effective on and which plants they're not. So making sure you identify and you know what plants you have and what your problem really is, I think is important. And then why do you have that problem? And so there's two main reasons that you have too many plants, which is, you have too many nutrients or you have too much sunlight. So plants need nutrients to grow and they need sunlight to grow. And so is your pond too shallow? Do you have cattle right upstream that are adding, nitrates into your system? Are you applying fertilizer that's washing in? Understanding that those kinds of issues are really important and great place to start. So get out there, have a plan, make sure that you understand that the best thing you can do is pull it out. There are going to be times where that's not feasible and you need to use herbicides or you need to use grass carp, but they're just part of the toolbox, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other biological control tools that we can have in our toolbox like grass carp?
Yeah, the other big one that's recommended a lot are tilapia. And so Nile tilapia can be added to ponds, and they do really well. They're fantastic. They'll eat everything. They'll eat duckweed. They eat watermeal. They eat algae. They are a silver bullet, except they have one little flaw, and that flaw is that they don't do well in cold water, right? And so, which is a good thing because they make so many offspring that if they did do well in cold water and you added them to your pond, you wouldn't be able to have anything else because they would make so many babies that they would take over your pond. But because they don't like cold water, as soon as that water hits 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, they're going to go belly up and they're going to die. And so you need to then go out and scoop them out of your pond. Otherwise, you've just added a bunch more nutrients into your pond, and next year you're going to have some really fertile soil. So you're going to see at the bottom of your pond, you're going to see even more vegetative growth, right? And people a lot of times are like, hey, I don't mind going out there. I'm going to make a good plan to get those tilapia out. They have good intentions. The thing to remember is, you don't know. It's not always October 15th that we hit that cold temperature mark. It could be the morning of a baseball game, or you have an important meeting at work, or you got, a date you want to go on that night or something. And when those fish are getting too cold, you need to get them out. And so that might mean, dropping what you're doing to go get them out, and planning around that isn't always easy. So understanding that tilapia are a tool, they may be helpful, but making sure that you can. Also, it's important for all of these biological controls. I'm focused on Kansas with a lot of what I'm talking about. There are state-by-state regulations, and tilapia are one fish that's heavily regulated. You're not allowed to add them in a lot of places. So make sure with tilapia, and grass carp, any other species, that you're checking your local regulations and that you are allowed to add them to your pond before you do.
That's definitely good advice. It sounds like with how hard tilapia are to plan for and all that kind of stuff, maybe you just ought to recruit a whole herd of snapping turtles to have out there to clean up the dead tilapia for you.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of happy people if we start doing that. They're opening up a whole nother can of worms.
Well, Joe, that was a really good discussion, I think. So what are your sort of final thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that not all plants are bad, right? And when we start to have weed issues, it's very frustrating. If you're fishing and every time you make a cast, you're having to pull weeds off, you're going swimming and it feels like things are grabbing your legs, or you're just looking out at your pond and you see too many plants, it's very easy to get that negative association with those plants. And so remembering that some plants are good, having a plan to get rid of too many plants is also good, but we want that balance, and plants can provide a lot of benefits. And so without plants, you're probably not going to have really good fishery. You're probably not going to like the water quality. It's probably going to start to smell bad over time. There's some issues that come with that. And so plants are generally good. When you get too many, you need to do something about it. And so figuring out what your issue is it the nutrient loading? Is it the amount of sunlight that you're getting, or is it something else? Understanding that underlying issue, I think, is key. Grass carp are part of our toolbox, and so we can add them. You need to understand that there may be some negative aspects that come along with adding them, especially down the road. 5, 10, 15 years from now, it might be something that is really, really bad to fix. A year from now, you might have more plants because you add them, and that is counterintuitive, but it is really important. So I think the last thing is start early. So if you are worried about too many plants, or you're starting to see it now, the sooner that you get out there and start controlling that vegetation, the better off you'll be.
Awesome. Well, that's great advice, Joe. Interesting topic. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we'll catch up with you in another couple of weeks.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.